March 15, 2019 special meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. I'll ask everyone to rise and place your hand over your heart and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call, please.
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Aranio?
Here.
Director Perello? Here. Director Borcher?
Here.
All right. Agenda review, any changes on the limited agenda we have?
Oh, I'm sorry, no.
So you know. Okay.
All right. Public comments. This is an opportunity for public comments. Anyone wishing to address the board on anything not otherwise on today's agenda, please feel free to step forward, identify yourself, and do so. Hearing none, we'll move on to board member comments. Any comments from members of the board? All right. Hearing none, we will move. Oh, yes, Bert, go ahead.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. In my comments, I need to return to an allocation ordinance. First, a question on what date will the ordinance come back to the board? And I'm wondering if somebody could answer that now. Okay, if not right now, I'll wait. Second, the cities have articulated a concern repeatedly through pumping in true emergency circumstances. I'm in a position where I represent the cities of Oxnard, Camarillo, Port Hueneme, Ventura, and Moore Park. We ask for an allowance of pumping when there is a clear emergency. In order to address the concern of possible abuse, we proposed relying on an emergency declaration. There wasn't supposed to be an additional requirement for a variance. It was supposed to be an exception to the variance process. At the last meeting, this board made the variance process more difficult, repeat, more difficult than addressing the legitimate concerns. The next time the ordinance comes forth, I'd like the board to address the concerns head on. The cities need an exception to the variance process, not another process that goes through the executive officer or the board for true dire emergencies. If the executive officer or the board must oversee the process, in the very least, write in a clear intention to approve any variance of an emergency so future executive officers and boards understand this board's intent. Third, I'm extremely concerned with the conversation regarding the O&H pipeline agreement. One of the GMA board members represents United. United has a direct interest in this language being kept out from the ordinance. There is a clear conflict here. Director Bennett hit the nail on the head at the last meeting when he said that if there's no O&H pipeline agreement, United does not have an obligation to supply the water to Oxnard's residents. That means the water should be kept for the benefit of Oxnard's residents. In fact, page 6 of the O&H pipeline agreement specifically states that United's GMA extraction allocation is, quote, held in trust, end quote, for Oxnard and other users, including P&H Water and other small water agencies. This board instructed United and Oxnard to work together to draft language for the ordinance. Oxnard staff sent proposed language to United in an effort to engage in good faith negotiations. However, if the two entities don't agree on the language and that ordinance isn't amended, the GMA is creating a huge benefit for United at the expense of Oxnard and the other cities that I represent in this position. United has every incentive to not reach common language with Oxnard and to keep the draft GMA ordinance as it currently reads, which gives United more than half of Oxnard's water. Repeat that, more than half of Oxnard's water. The board is locking the largest city in this county into an agreement favorable to another entity to the disadvantage of ours and other residents of other communities that I represent. Oxnard will engage in good faith negotiations with United as the GMA requested. However, I ask my fellow board members, please ensure that at the end of the day, Oxnard has the ability to exit the O&H pipeline agreement or negotiate a new deal on an equal playing field as United. This means that Oxnard's water belongs to Oxnard, and it is a temporarily held in trust by United. The ordinance should recognize that. The future of Oxnard and the other cities depend on it. Thank you very much.
Moving on then to the regular agenda, item number 1. Kathleen, is that you?
Good afternoon, Chairman West and directors. For the record, my name is Kathleen Rydell, and I'm here to present item 1, which is authorize executive officer to apply for and to enter into contract for Department of Water Resources technical support services to install nested monitoring wells in the Oxnard Subbasin and the Pleasant Valley Basin, and take any further necessary action to secure technical support services or funding. There's an opportunity for the agency to have monitoring wells installed. It is through the Department of Water Resources Technical Support Services Program. And the program installs monitoring wells. In your agenda packet under item 1A, it has a flyer on technical support services and what services are available. Technical support services is available to groundwater sustainability agencies. The services are provided through DWR contractors and generally without cost. The primary initial prioritization for funding for these projects is that they are to go to overdrafted basins and into the high and medium priority basins. Within the agency, in the Oxnard subbasin, there are data gaps in our existing groundwater monitoring network. And there. You can see that there's a gap. This illustration comes from the preliminary draft groundwater sustainability plan. It's chapter 4. This particular illustration is those wells which are perforated, screened exclusively in the Oxnard aquifer. So the area right in here, you'll see that there's no little squares indicating that there are wells screened exclusively in the Oxnard aquifer. And then over in this area, in what is the pumping depression, you'll see that there's no little squares. The little squares are indicated shaded or the light gray boxes with the state well numbers indicated. So those indicate those wells which are in the network, which are exclusively screened in that particular aquifer. And you can see that there are data gaps. This is the Grimes Canyon Aquifer, again taken from the preliminary draft groundwater sustainability plan. You'll see that the wells, well, there it is. You can see where the wells are located that are screened exclusively in the Grimes Canyon Aquifer. However, there are no wells identified which are screened exclusively in other areas of the basin. So there are data gaps in the existing network for monitoring water levels, water quality, and be able to determine the movement of water between aquifers, to be able to analyze that. The installation of monitoring wells is expensive. So the agency has the opportunity, and if the agency wishes to follow through on this program and have the monitoring wells installed, there are 2 applications that need to be submitted. First is the general application. The agency staff submitted the general application, and then the agency was notified on January 16th, 2019, that those applications for general services were approved. However, now we have to get to the site-specific applications if we want to go forward. So as I said, next step is to submit the site-specific services, the specific services the agency wants. If approved, technical support services would fund the installation of 1 or more monitoring wells. And then per the notice that we received when we were approved, they prefer having these wells sited on government public property. With that in mind, agency staff went back to the maps of where where are the data gaps, where are the preferred locations for monitoring wells, reviewed those and looked at where the government land is, that we might be able to site a monitoring well, or one or two or more. And there are 2 locations that were identified as good locations for monitoring wells. One, right there, proposed monitoring location along the Revlon Slough is one location in the Oxnard Plain. We would be able to put in a nested monitoring well to hit the Grimes, Fox, Hueneme, hit the Oxnard, Magoo aquifers in the semi-perch zone. The other location is in the northern portion of the Pleasant Valley Basin, and both of these figures come from the preliminary draft groundwater sustainability plan. So, when the general application was approved, DWR forwarded the TSS agreement, Technical Support Services Agreement. It was included in your agenda packet for your review. And so the next one is, so the agreement is in the agenda packet. We were told that it was best to get the applications in sooner or later than later because funding is limited. So they're encouraging us to move forward, and Technical Support Services will cover the installation of the monitoring wells, including the supplies and whatever equipment is needed to install those. They have a cap, which they're not quite sure of what it is yet. If your installation exceeds that cap, they may ask for a cost-sharing agreement and do cost sharing. So agency staff, if you approve this, applications moving forward, agency staff will return to your board with additional agreements if required, or whatever agreements are required, including such things as easement agreements. And if a cost share is requested, if there are additional costs, what those costs are, and we would bring those back to your board. So in conclusion, there are gaps in the existing monitoring network, and nested well locations were proposed in the preliminary draft groundwater sustainability plan. And to access the program, both the general and the site-specific applications need to be submitted and approved by the Department of Water Resources. It is staff's recommendation that your board authorize the executive officer to apply for and enter into the attached agreement with the Department of Water Resources for technical support services to install 1 or more nested monitoring wells in the Oxnard Basin, subbasin, and the Pleasant Valley Basin, and take any further necessary action to secure technical support services or funding. Any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
Could you go back to the one that is proposed for the PV area? What's the thinking on the location of that one, the reasoning?
It is in the northern Pleasant Valley Basin. It is along the Arroyo Las Posas. What is important is understanding there's some a data gap in understanding exactly how much water is flowing into the Pleasant Valley Basin. So getting it along the Arroyo Las Posas, we get the shallower stream flow and whatever else is being flowing into the groundwater system.
Thank you.
Kathleen?
Yes.
How does this proposed location match up with the North Pleasant Valley Desalter and their monitoring wells that they were going to be putting in?
There is not a proposed monitoring well. We've been asking for one north of their proposed location. However, their proposed location is right in this area. So that's where the proposed North Pleasant Valley desalter is located.
It's a good point. It wasn't, remind me, I forget the details of that, but wasn't there monitoring required on that project, and there were wells specified for that monitoring?
Yes, there are wells identified for monitoring. A lot of them are down gradient of the facility, proposed facility, and laterally, but there had been a disagreement on getting one. They didn't want to drill one north of their desalter project. They felt the impact would be down gradient of their project.
Okay, so this gives you information right at, okay, thank you.
Just, you mentioned that these sites have to be placed on hopefully government property. What government property is the site planning to be sited on?
According to, it would be Watershed Protection District. It's termed in the, according to the assessor's office, as flood control district property.
It's hard to argue when the state wants to come pay for services that we need, but, and any other questions or comments from the board before I turn it to the public?
Sure, we can find something to argue.
Thank you, Kathleen. Any questions or comments from the general public?
Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Lucy McGovern, and I'm with the City of Camarillo. And looking at the map for the Pleasant Valley Basin area, we are currently drilling 3 wells. They are downstream of the North Pleasant Valley Treatment Facility. And actually, the one in yellow is something that we're looking at. We actually are trying to come up with an agreement with United Water to come up with some sort of finalizing the location of that well. So it isn't that we haven't been working on it, but we definitely need to determine the appropriate location, what areas we need to investigate for upstream conditions. So that's still something that we're looking at. As far as the ones downstream of it, one of the wells is near the location. They're all, so one of them is that we've just completed drilling is at Avenida Caso, and I can't tell from that map, and via Pescador. The other one's at Adolfo Park, and which is Lewis, and Adolfo, which is very close to that PNW 20, and then the other one is at City Hall. Just wanted to, so they are going to be complementing the locations that you're suggesting there. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Brian Bondi. I just have a question. I know other GSAs are trying to go through this process, and one of the things that's been difficult to get from DWR is clarity on how deep their contractor for this program in Southern California is able to drill. And so if you have any information on that, I'd be very interested to know, because I've been having a hard time getting an answer. Thank you.
The answer I received from the Department of Water Resources earlier this week was that they've contacted and they're working with their contractor to find out if they can drill as deep as 2,000 feet, because a number of applications have been received for wells down to a depth of 2,000 feet. The proposed depth, based on the available information, in the Oxnard Plain would be a monitoring well for the Grimes at about a depth of 1,400 feet is the proposed depth for that monitoring well, maximum. They felt that that was not an issue.
Okay. Thank you, Kathleen. Any other questions or comments? John?
No questions. John Linquist, United Water Conservation District, and United staff have not really coordinated with the GMA staff on this issue, but of course we support any opportunity to get basically free or support, financial support for drilling wells and technical support from DWR. And so although we don't know much about the specifics of this proposal or haven't heard before today, that we would certainly support the overall concept of taking their financial support. DWR has expressed to us on a couple of GSA issues that they're having trouble getting all of the bond money that they've got for Prop 1 out to their GMAs. And so this is an opportunity to help them spend their bond money.
If they mention that again, just tell them, send any leftovers this way. That's, thank you, John. Anyone else? Any discussion among the board? Chair will entertain a motion.
I have, Chair, just one quick question. Maybe
Before
it's
you do that, I mean, hearing that last motion, I think we should have a raise for all of the board members. Anyway.
double our current pay?
Yeah, right.
It's a question maybe for our executive officer, but if in fact that Camarillo and United are looking at a well where this one is proposed, do you have another location that you might like to use these funds for? I'm thinking maybe the the joining of the West Las Posas and the forebay to get better clarity on that connection.
Well, as I understand it, this has all been through TAG, and I'll let Kathleen go to that question. It's more of a
Okay.
technical one.
Okay, the proposed monitoring wells have been seen by TAG. So if I, well, this one, it's not going backwards. So those have been reviewed and looked at by TAG as they reviewed the preliminary draft groundwater sustainability plan. We can propose any location in the Oxnard subbasin or the Pleasant Valley Basin. They are, in speaking with the DWR representative this past week and last week, was that they would like to, they're favoring getting as many monitoring wells and as many different basins as possible. So, and they did state that they've received, for one basin, 5 applications for monitoring wells. So they have online, if nobody else wants to submit applications, they will be drilling 5 monitoring wells in a different basin. So
I
we can
forgot the
change
criteria
locations.
of the critically overdrafted too. That's probably the first criteria, right? So,
Right.
okay, thank you. Good enough.
The gentleman that asked about the depth of the well and who's going to be drilling, at one time I'd had an opportunity to work on a drill rig. I hope that we take a company that can work equally easy in that range versus a company that can work at the extreme limits when they get down to that range. It makes a big difference in the quality of the rig and the experience. And I hope we check that because a lot can go on.
Okay, we will be working with the DWR selected contractor, and the name was mentioned, who the drilling contractor is. And I don't know if I should state that now, but it is one that has a very good reputation and is familiar with installing monitoring wells and drilling lots of other wells also.
Anything else? The chair will entertain a motion then to authorize the executive officer to apply for and enter into the technical support services agreement with DWR for development of monitoring wells.
I'd make that motion, Chair.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Get a roll call.
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Bennett? Director Aranio?
Aye.
Director Perello? Director Borchert?
Yes.
Thank you, Kathleen. Moving on then to item number 2 on the agenda. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board, Kim Loeb, GMA staff. So this item is to receive a report on the peer review that was conducted on the 2 models that the GSPs are relying upon, the one developed by United Water Conservation District and the one developed by Cayugas Municipal Water District, that this agency contracted to run future sustainability simulations for our GSP development process and planning. And your board authorized DUDEC as an additional scope of work to do a peer review of those models, principally with a real focus of quantifying the uncertainty. And they worked with their lead peer reviewer, Dr. Daniel Tartakovsky from Stanford University, and he is here today to present this to you. The peer review report is available online at our website, and without any more, I'll ask Dr. Tartakovsky if I'm pronouncing that right. So how this works is that'll be forward, that'll be back, and if you hold that for a moment, it'll bring up the cursor, but it's a little sort of a cursor.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for your attention. Before I start with the technical part, I would like to mention that this peer review, the way it unfolded, it was in close collaboration and in multiple iterations with Jason Sun at United and the members of the TAG team. So I think that's been a really collaborative effort, and I believe that the final report that we prepared is much better for it. So I will start and finish with key findings of the report, and then in between I will substantiate these points. So we reviewed both models, and we found that the construction of the models, the software that has been used, the model calibration, all of these technical things followed it generally accepted and best practices in the field. And both use the best information about basins that is available from previous investigations. And for all of those reasons, we believe that the models are appropriate to rely upon for the initial estimate of the sustainable yield and for you to make a decision on how to proceed. And so what we really focused on is something that has been the subject of a relatively recent report by National Research Council, which is under United States National Academy of Sciences. And it dealt with the issue that is present in every model of not just groundwater, but really any computational model you can think of in any field of science, engineering, in anything, medicine. And the issue is that the central question of that report is, given inevitable flaws, how should computational results be viewed by those who wish to act on them? So that, I think, is very important to understand what we were after, and I guess how one should approach modeling results. So any model that you could think of would have flaws. So the issues are not whether you could construct a model of anything, again, including these two basins, that has no flaws. That there is no such thing. But the question is, given that there are flaws and they are inevitable, how can we believe or make sense of these results of these models, right? And the answer that National Research Council came up with was that we need to assess uncertainties that are inherent in any model of a physical system, and that we should not rely on a single answer, but we should strive to come up with confidence intervals of these predictions. And so then that is exactly what our review focused on. So it was not so much that we tried to criticize or poke holes in the existing models. We wanted to understand what are the uncertainties and within these model predictions, and how do you quantify them and make sense of them. Okay, and so I will start with UWCD model, primarily because they have conducted a detailed sensitivity analysis that we could start with, use as a starting point in our study. And so this model has about 500,000 of knobs or parameters that one could tune to make model predict practically anything. And so how do you know whether your model predicts what it should predict, or predict the nature, what happens underground? It is really by comparing the model predictions with observations, with what is measured. Okay, and so 500,000 knobs is just, if you can think of it, is you could do anything with them. And so to reduce this large over-parameterization, the authors of the model subdivided the basin. Here's here's an example. Doesn't seem to work, right? Into around 3,000 homogeneous areas. They are not specific geological units, but they were identified based on best available science that was available at the time. And each of these subdomains, those different color regions, they were treated as if they were homogeneous. And so at every element, every point in that domain has the same value of hydraulic conductivity and other parameters. So that allowed the authors of the model to reduce the number of knobs from 500,000 to around 3,000, so which is much more manageable when you want to parameterize your model. And what are the sources of uncertainty? Why are we saying that any model has flaws, including this one? Is that if you look at the table to your right, the right on the slide, so you could see a natural variability of different geological units, their hydraulic conductivity. So in the region that we are interested in, say that there is the subsurface contains everything from clay to gravel, so hydraulic conductivity could vary, by 4 or 5 orders of magnitude. So when you tune the knob, you could span these 5 orders of magnitude. Just in hydraulic conductivity, and there are many other parameters. And so how do these knobs then tune? Select the values of the parameters are selected. Well, you look at observations of hydraulic heads at all the wells that are available in the basins, and you run your model with a certain with certain values of parameters. You compare the model prediction with the observations. You see a huge disagreement on average, so you say, okay, I need to adjust my parameters and so the authors have done that until on average, the difference between all observations and all model predictions was the smallest they could get, so that they minimized the error, and there are different ways of quantifying this error. So there is root mean square error or mean absolute error. So these are different ways to compute the discrepancy between the observations and model predictions. Okay, and this is a standard procedure. It's always done in the absence of observations. That's how you find parameters for your model. But then the question inevitably arises, okay, well, so you found these optimal parameters that you think are optimal, but the reality is much messier than our model can describe. So how sensitive are the model predictions to the changes in the parameter values? Because we did not measure the parameters, they were just estimated from this procedure. So here, to answer that question, we conducted a global sensitivity analysis where we allowed all the parameters that are described in the table and the report, the 28 of them that we looked at. We allowed them to vary over many orders of magnitude to see uncertainty in which parameter is most important for the model predictions. And so you can see from this pie chart, each color here represents a different parameter, each piece of the pie. And so the largest pieces here, they are hydraulic conductivities in the Oxner aquifer and in the Magoo aquifer, and both are in the Forbay region. So combined, they contribute, you could see, to a substantial portion of the uncertainty. And this actually is a good result in a sense, because these are the parts of the basin where there are observation wells, where there have been tests. So these are the regions that are mostly more constrained than others. So when we talk about this uncertainty over many orders of magnitude, so in these regions, which have the highest sensitivity, there are actual measurements. So that means that the confidence in the model predictions is higher than it would otherwise be. But so having said that, what we've done, not just we, what the authors of the model, and in fact what the community of groundwater engineers does, they minimize the average discrepancy between the observations and the model predictions. But that's not to say that at any individual well, you would get the smallest possible error. So because this is average over the whole basin. And so because we are mostly interested in sustainable yield, and sustainable yield is, well, we are exclusively interested in sustainable yield, and because sustainable yield is largely determined by seawater intrusion, and the seawater intrusion obviously occurs along the coast, we looked at the wells where we had data that are located along the coast. So there is, so this thing doesn't really do anything. So one of the wells that we looked at is in that box. We have other wells as well in the report. And here you can see the discrepancy between the model predictions and the observations. So the model predictions are the solid line, observations are dots. And you could see that there is indeed...
The model's predictions are which line?
Pardon me? The black is the model prediction, and the dots are observations.
Historical is the observed.
Right, historical.
Thank you.
Right. And so you could see that there is some discrepancy, but that's the issue of having a glass half full, half empty. This is actually a pretty good model prediction, because you could see the trend is matched nearly perfectly. In fact, it's 100% perfectly, where model predicts that the water level drops, the actual observations indeed drop. So, but there is a discrepancy, right? And so then the question is that we wanted to answer: how does this discrepancy affect or propagate in your estimation or confidence interval in the predictions of the yield? So this is what I'll talk about for the next few minutes. Okay, and what we looked at specifically was the seawater flux, because this is the amount of seawater that enters the aquifer through a cross-section along the coast. And I will next talk.
Yeah, so if you want that closer, just hold that down for a moment and it'll come up.
Yeah, right, I tried that. Actually, thank you. Yeah, there we go. So predictions of the seawater flux, so seawater intrusion. So that's the way we did it. We repeatedly solved. Oh, that's the wrong way. We essentially conducted 120 runs of our model for different parameters whose values were selected not at random, but there is some science behind it that is described in the report again. And so this 120 model predictions plus the original model, 121 predictions of different models. With each of them, we computed seawater flux, the total seawater flux at the outcrop. And then we conducted a statistical analysis of these 121 predictions. So this is no different than exactly what is being done, say, in hurricane predictions or any other prediction of a natural system where you have uncertainty. So you do alternative models and you average. That's what we've done. And so from these 121 models, we came up with the following values for the average seawater flux and the standard deviation. Standard deviation is a measure of uncertainty in the model predictions. Okay, so for the upper aquifer system, it's between 85 and over 30 years period. So the average seawater flux is 4,000 acre-feet per year. And in the lower aquifer, it's close to 6,000 acre-feet per year. And so these are predictions, because we don't have measurements or observations of the actual seawater fluxes. And so the standard deviations for these predictions are close to 2,000 acre-feet per year for the upper aquifer and around 800 acre-feet per year for lower aquifer system. Okay, so then we have this variability in the predictions, so that the predictions are uncertain. So which parameters then contribute most to the uncertainty in the predictions? So this is again quantified by means of the sensitivity analysis and this pie chart here. And again, you could see that the largest slices of this pie are the same values, are the same parameters. So these are hydraulic conductivities in the domains where we have measurements. So that means that our model predictions are parameterized by data that are measured at places where we need measurements to be. That's not to say that we don't need any more observation wells, because you can see that that there is the whole large portion of the pie is still there. So the more data we get, the more accurate the predictions would be in the future. Okay, so now having assessed this expected or average seawater flux and the confidence interval for these predictions, now we are in a position to say what a safe yield would be. So a sustainable yield would be. So to do that, we have done the following. So we run the existing model for 6 different pumping rate and different project scenarios. Like these are dots on the graph here, and then we use the linear regression analysis to draw this straight line to identify the point here on the graph where what pumping would give us 0 seawater intrusion. And so that value we estimated to be 42,000 acre-feet per year. Right? So having said that, and based on everything I said before, this one value of 42,000 by itself is not very meaningful unless I tell you what the confidence intervals are for this prediction. And so we estimated those, and by the procedure is described in the report. And again, I made a presentation at the TAG meeting where we went through the math in detail. But so the confidence interval for this 42,000 acre-feet per year in the both upper and lower aquifer is plus minus 6,000 acre-feet per year. Okay, this result here comes with a couple of caveats. So one of them is that, and these caveats are related to how we think of plus minus 6,000. So out of all 121 model runs that we had, a majority of them predicted smaller values of seawater intrusion than the original United model. So that tells us that the values are more likely to be 42 plus than they are 42 minus, just because we don't have a nice symmetric Gaussian distribution. So not every plus and minus are created equal from this point of view.
And
Yes.
Is that because when you showed us the plot graph with the model and the historical, when things were up, they were pretty close together. But when things were down, that's when the gap grew between the model and the historical. Is that what's causing?
So not exactly, because this is just one well out of many, and again in the report there are more wells, and it is not.
Okay, thank you.
There is no systematic bias in the model. And so based on that, on this confidence interval that we constructed, so now then the question is what our recommendation would be on how to proceed forward. So, and again, I urge you to keep in mind that quote from from the National Research Council that there is no perfect model. Every model would have flaws. You cannot study the problem with the goal of having zero flaws or zero uncertainty. It's always present. So given that, what can we do if we want to improve our model? Well, we would probably want to continue data collection because that's what help us. It would help us to parameterize model further. And for that, these observation wells that were proposed are a great help. But our second recommendation is that the data collected during this next 5 years, say, and going forward, should be used not only for model calibration to keep turning the knobs, but also to see how powerful the model is in predicting the future, right? And so that's what is often referred to as model validation. And then we use that linear regression where we drew a straight line to see where which pumping rate corresponds to zero seawater intrusion. So that there are more robust ways that this value could be arrived at by, say, running the same model repeatedly for different pumping rates and scenarios and finding the exact combination that would give you zero seawater intrusion. But that based on the tightness of based on the tightness of this graph there and this point here, it's unlikely that you would get much different result. It's possible to do it, but I should speed up.
No, quick. How did you go about quantifying the measure of uncertainty? I see you've got the 6,000 acre feet, but how do you get there?
That's what it's in the report. So what we've done is the following. So we have we use this linear regression to say, so Y here is the seawater intrusion. This is the flux, and X here is the pumping rate. So if for Y, for the seawater intrusion, for seawater flux, we computed the mean and variance, so we know uncertainty in the predictions of that quantity. And so because of that linear relationship, there is a unique way to translate uncertainty in Y into uncertainty in X. And so that's what we've done. Yeah. So in that part, there is no assumption. That was just one formula that we used. Okay, so now switching gears a bit, this is about the second model, CMWD. So there we did not conduct this quantitative analysis that I just described for UWCD. And so here we looked at potential sources of uncertainty and available data and historical studies, prior studies, to see whether there is a consistency between everything that's available, the best science available at the moment. So let's start with hydraulic heads. So the observations that we came up with, and I think they are not particularly, well, they're not contentious, period. These are just facts. So the model reproduces historical heads very well in the south and central areas of the basin. In a few wells where in the northwest, they were not reproduced as well. And again, because that they did not do this rigorous sensitivity analysis, we could not look at how exactly, what's happening more. But another potential source of uncertainty in most groundwater models is recharge and discharge, because these are typically less constrained by data. But in this particular case, in this particular basin, it is actually not the case, because the largest contribution to recharge is in infiltration from Arroyo Las Pozas. there are measurements, and the model does a great job reproducing those measurements, so that instills confidence in the model predictions. Infiltration of rain, that is typically a very large source of uncertainty because not everything that rains infiltrates to the groundwater. But the estimate that the model came up with is comparable to the previous study that was conducted independently and unrelated to this study. So that's another confirmation that the model is doing what it's supposed to do. And then there were some things that where there are no measurements to fall back on. So, for example, recharge in the Grimes Canyon aquifer outcrop. So that's not measured, but it is a relatively minor contributor to the overall water balance, 10%. And then there are, say, return flows from irrigation. What happened? Wasn't you? Okay. So again, the numbers that the model came up with, they are broadly in line with. Now you have to believe me, there are no numbers, but they are in line with what's been observed in other studies. Right. And another thing which I think is great for this basin is that the 93% of recharge due to pumping is metered here. So that's usually a large source of uncertainty in groundwater models. Here it's practically insignificant because of all the metering that is being done since. So this is true post 85, of course, not before. Okay, so then to sum up what I just said, so the largest potential sources of uncertainty that we identified, they are hydraulic properties, their historical pumping and recharge. So this would generally be the largest sources of uncertainty. But in this case, they are reasonably well constrained by measurements and observations. So that's good. Recharge, there are some contributions like recharge in the Grimes Canyon aquifer. That is a certain source of uncertainty that is not constrained. There are no measurements to constrain against. But relative contribution of those effects is relatively small, so around 9% of the total basin-wide pumping. So as a conclusion, based on everything I just said, that the agreement with the data, observations, the agreement with previous studies, the model we believe is reliable to use in the initial assessment. It could be improved, but it is a good model. Reproduces what's known, the best available data. The model estimates well the recharge from the Arroyo Las Posas, potential changes from the to the flow in and infiltration from the Arroyo as most significant. They are likely to change due to changing conditions in the future. Okay, and so the data collected during the next 5 years should be used again to validate this model, and we should, I think, another thing that I think is not in the bullet, sensitivity analysis similar to the previous model would help to come up with more quantitative error bars or confidence intervals for the model predictions. But key findings then, this is the slide that I started with, and therefore I will just finish with the last slide. again, given the fact that any model that comes in front of you would have flaws, the question then is this model useful? And so given the confidence intervals that are relatively tight, we believe that these models are appropriate to make an initial estimate of what sustainable yield is for both aquifers. So thank you. And
Thank you. Any questions from the board? Oops.
So I was reminded that there is an exponent letter that critiqued our findings and critiqued the two models I was just talking about. So I could address them now, or maybe it would come up in your questions. It's up to you how you, or maybe we could just ignore it, whatever you prefer.
Go ahead and address that now, if you would.
Okay, so the exponent letter has 3 authors and who raised several questions about the two models primarily, and they used our peer review as sometimes to justify their comments, but they came to an opposite conclusion from what we came, and that's why I felt that I want to address this issue for you. There are several issues, one of which is the fact that based on what we wrote, the authors of that exponent letter claim that these models could not be trusted because they have not been validated, and so new and better models are needed. So the quote from the National Academies of Sciences, I think, would address that issue, that there is no perfect model. There are inevitable flaws in any model, and to the extent that both models followed best practices, that they are grounded in data. We estimated uncertainty in their predictions. That I think is what is required in modern science-based predictions to go forward. And if the board is comfortable with the confidence interval that you have, and within that you see a room forward, then I believe you should go. You should use these models. The second point was that this sensitivity analysis, these pie charts that I presented to you, that this is new science and it is not a settled science. So that I personally strongly disagree with, in the sense that this is math. It's not like drugs that have to go, look at side effects and go get an FDA approval. Math is either right or wrong, and they did not provide any indications that what we've done is wrong. And in fact, I firmly believe what we've done is at the cutting edge of science, and that there is no room to doubt. And they did not doubt that. They just said, well, it's too new to do it that way. So I don't believe it's a valid criticism. The issue of model validation, that was the third point that they raised. And there is actually a debate in groundwater community whether groundwater models can be ever validated given the time span. In fact, my advisor, who was a famous hydrogeologist, used to say, we picked the right field because by the time people would know the models are wrong, we'll be long dead. That's just because groundwater moves very slowly. And so to validate the model means to say how, the question is, the model predicts certain things 30 years from now, 20 years from now. to validate it perfectly, we would have to wait 20 years and see whether the model predicted what actually observed. That's in principle a great thing to do if you could afford to.
There are some of us who will volunteer, but
Right. Yeah. So in lieu of that, we again followed the best science that is available. We studied uncertainty in the model predictions, and we studied sensitivity of these model predictions to variability in the input parameters. So as long as you are okay and comfortable with that, then the reason for doing that is to instill confidence in the model predictions. So that's, I think, what I would say about that.
any questions or comments from the board? Steve?
I just have a question for staff, and that is, staff, as engineers, as our staff, if you guys have objectively evaluated the objective peer evaluation of the model, do you have any insights, thoughts on this to sort of interpret the results for the board?
Yes, Director Bennett, Board, yes, we concur with the conclusions that the peer review report came to. We think it was appropriately conducted and came to the correct conclusions and identified some areas for improvement, but the conclusions were correct.
Thank you.
And do I understand correctly that you've made a similar presentation, or a similar presentation has been made to the technical advisory group already?
Similarly, in the sense that it dealt with this problem, but every slide had equations. And so Kim was horrified and said to remove all equations. So what you are seeing here is a different presentation, but
we got the simpler version. Thank you. Thank you. That's okay.
You have a deeper version.
Thank you. Any other comment?
Number one, thank you very much for your presentation. I liked how you tied a couple of things in, models and mortality. I mean, that's why they make makeup and airbrushes. But the issue with the question that I've asked earlier in the day with respect to, and a term you used quite frequently, is to address uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the questions that I asked of staff, when there will be an allocation ordinance and when there's an expectation for it to come back. But one of the questions that you addressed and that you brought up, and I wish that we would have been able to show you how to use the pointer a little earlier, and I hope the staff takes that to heart. The models, nothing is perfect in the world. You do the best that you can, and they wouldn't have hired you, I would assume, if you were not very good in your field. So we have to trust the expertise that you bring to the table. But in due respect to you, I would like to know, how do you pronounce your last name? I wouldn't even try, but I really would like to know it here from you.
The introduction was very threatening, and the question is quite nice. So my last name is Tartakovsky.
Can you say it again?
Tartakovsky.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation.
And I did learn how to use a PowerPoint by the end of my presentation.
Anyone else? Thank you, Doctor. Any questions or comments from the public?
Need that, thank you. John Lindquist again from United Water Conservation District. And our lead modeler, Jason Sun, Dr. Jason Sun, couldn't be here today due to family issues that he had to address. So I'm up here instead of him today. I just wanted to mention, first of all, thanks for the review. Dr. Tartakovsky worked closely with Jason and perhaps with the Callegas folks too, to work through a number of issues. And I understand it went both ways. We were also able to help them with their analysis. It was a very cooperative approach, and we're pleased with the results. We still have a few lingering kind of issues or concerns that Jason, Dr. Sun, will be asking them about, minor issues, very mathy, not worth bringing to this board, but probably a few little things that we still want to work out. In the big picture, the Stanford team seems to agree that the model, the United model and the Callegas model, are reasonably good models, and we aren't surprised. We had previous reviews by our expert panel, which was the equivalent of having Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking review your high school science project, and they liked the, the results also. I think Dr. Tartakovsky will recognize the names Dr. Saurabh Pandey and then Jim Rumbaugh as well. And then we've also talked to Randy Henson, who made the USGS model for the basin back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It was the best possible model at its time. He liked the improvements that we made in the United model, I know that, and figured and pointed out that, hey, it does a lot more things than their old model did, the USGS model that people relied on for over 10 years. And finally, the TAG members reviewed both models. Jason had comments on the Callegas model. The Intera folks that worked for Callegas had comments on our model. We helped each other. We reviewed each other critically. And then TAG members, I don't know if they'll come out to you and say this, but they've said to me that they really think that the United model was a significant improvement over what was available in the past. So I think everybody at this point should agree the model's good. Now, if you'll take my word on anything, I hope it will be this, that the uncertainties in the models aren't that big. I mean, the ones with the uncertainties involving parameters that you put in, like hydraulic conductivities and whatnot, aren't that big compared to the real life uncertainties that affect the results, including sustainable yield. And they're inputs that aren't model parameters, like what is the climate really going to do in the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years? We don't know how much it's going to rain. We have cycles where rainfall is 150% of what it was the previous 10 years, and cycles where it's much less for a 10-year period. We can't predict that. Those aren't really model inputs. Those are assumptions we have to make. Minimum thresholds and measurable objectives make a huge difference on sustainable yield. And I'll come back to that in a second on your sustainable yield estimate. And then other assumptions like what constitutes projects, where you distribute pumping, how growth might occur on the plain over time. Those have big impacts too. Those aren't model uncertainties. Those are assumption uncertainties and uncertainties about the future. So all these factors make for some uncertainty about estimates of sustainable yield for the future. And we have to rely on the model to forecast absolutes based on our assumption, absolute water levels, absolutes regarding seawater influx. But and so that's where the model really has its most difficulties, when you're trying to model future absolute values like water levels and seawater fluxes. And again, it's not a model problem, it's the input questions. So where a model really shines is comparing different scenarios. And there, I think Dr. Tartakovsky and Peter Quinlan and others, other modeling experts, would agree that that's where the differences and the uncertainties to decrease. If you're comparing two different pumping scenarios, for example, the model does a much better job of telling you what the likely differences are between those scenarios and the absolute result of either one of those scenarios. So we've always known the sustainable yield in the Oxnard Plain and Pleasant Valley basins is a lot lower than current pumping rates. We've known that since the 50s, really. We could have guessed pretty closely what sustainable yield would be. What we need to do now is to figure out the best way to get ourselves out of that jam and not focus solely on sustainable yield. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Any other questions or comments?
Good afternoon again, Brian Bondi on behalf of Callegas. I was the project manager for the Callegas model. We contracted with a firm called Intera to do the bulk of the work. And I just wanted to make a few comments or clarifications just for the record. Some of the discussion about the model was related to what was referred to as the Grimes Canyon area and issues there. That area is actually outside of the basin, and it's tributary to the basin. Anybody who's familiar with the Happy Camp Regional Park, that's the area we're talking about. There's nothing up there. There's no wells, no data. There will always be no data in this area, so this is going to always be an issue or a challenge for simulating the East Las Posas Basin. We've actually been working on an alternative version of the model to address some of the points that were made by the reviewers or various reviewers that you've received comments on. So just want to let you know that that's out there. In terms of the sensitivity analysis, I just want to make sure that the impression isn't left on the board and the public that that wasn't done. Actually, it was done. It was something that before we did it, we went through TAG last June on the approach, and that information was developed. All the runs were completed and was available for the review. Unfortunately, I think because it wasn't in our first draft report, there was some misunderstanding that that information wasn't available, but it is. And in fact, Cayugas was really hoping and looking forward to having the numerical uncertainty analysis performed on the model because we agree that quantifying uncertainty is probably the single most important thing we can be doing right now with these models to put them in perspective. And so it's something that we hope there is still an opportunity to have that work done. I've put in an inquiry to staff about that to see if we could go ahead and do that here after the fact, just to have the documentation. Because what happens if you don't have the uncertainty analysis is the discussion around the model devolves into a what about this discussion that has no end. The value of the uncertainty analysis is you can say, there is uncertainty in the model. All of those what about this items are encapsulated in a quantitative assessment of the uncertainty. And you can end a discussion because at that point you can say it's this plus or minus that, the types of numbers that you saw. And that's what we'd like to have for the Cayugas model. And we'll be pursuing that either through the GMA or potentially independently to get that work done. I agree wholeheartedly with John from United about uncertainty in the future is as important or more important than the uncertainty in the models themselves. DWR understands this. That's why Sigma is written and the regulations are developed with an adaptive management framework so that we can adapt to and deal with this uncertainty in our management as we proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Anyone else? Anything more from the board? Doctor, thank you so much for your presentation. This is a receive and file. Thank you. At this point, the meeting will adjourn to closed session. We will resume at the end of the closed session and close the meeting and invite everybody back for the stakeholder workshop on MTs and MOs at 4 o'clock. Thank you. All right, we are resuming the meeting back from closed session, only to report that no reportable action was taken in closed session. We're adjourned.